Thank you so much for the warm introduction and hello everyone. My name is Apalak. So glad that you could all make it for today's session. We have a great lineup of discussions. Bear with me for the first 25 minutes. I'll try to walk you through how I look at a very important element of hybrid IT. But post that we have a amazing panel where I talk to some of my CIO friends who've been there, done that, know the tricks of the trade, and then we have a session from our friends at Dell, right? So without further ado, let me jump right in. So I think when you hear the word hybrid, and not even hybrid IT, I think that's the most topical word that I've been hearing for some time now. You call hybrid work, you call hybrid IT. So I think we understand this is for the times that we live in and the times that we are going to see in near term. I think this is a term that we'll be hearing pretty often, right? And today we would like to dovetail a little bit about what is some composition of hybrid IT as we call it, right? What are some of the elements of hybrid IT? What are some of the challenges of hybrid IT? And what is the future of each of these elements, which constitutes hybrid IT, right? So before I get into that, I think a small walkthrough to the park in terms of how we've seen, the evolution of computing. Remember, there was a time when we used to have, mainframes. When I say remember, I wasn't even born during that time. I'm talking about the early 60s to 70s when we had the mainframes. So it was a centralized computing hub, and it was typically a hub and spoke model with dumb terminals, right? That was where the entire story started, right? Then moving on, there was a phase of the 90s and 80s. That's where the PC came into limelight. So and the processing power was truly at the end user's end. The processing was happening at the desktop slash personal computer slash laptop, right? So this is the time of the PC. That's what called the PC era. Then came a very, very interesting phase of the early 2000s. This is when we saw the advent of the web and the internet, right? So we used to access, applications and websites. We were typically hosted, in a centralized on-premise DC or server, right? And not to suggest that they don't exist anymore. They are pretty much still part of the picture. But then moving on, then came a phase of, which still continues very strongly, by the way, of cloud computing. So I have had the good fortune of traveling the journey of cloud computing, at least in India, because long time back with much less gray hair, I used to be a much younger analyst. I used to cover the cloud computing area. I remember my first few days of when I used to write the initial reports of cloud computing, define what SaaS constitutes, what IaaS constitutes, what PaaS constitutes. So it's been a very, very interesting journey. So which was again cloud computing, again, as you all know, the processing happens at centralized hyperscale data centers, right? Where all the compute is hosted, and your access is through your PCs or laptops, right? Through a browser. Then came the entire concept of edge computing. So when I say 2020 onwards, this is not to suggest that this was not there prior to this, but then I think it truly came on its own. And what we essentially mean by edge computing is, you have data and applications which are processed and across distributed micro data centers, edge sites, devices, and terminals. So if you see, there is this IT infrastructure computing resources have ebbed and flown from centralized to distributed computing environments. So it's been an oscillating journey. And what is interesting is, and that's the entire premise of today's discussion, is how this journey has been so far, and going forward, how all of them converge. So if you look at the way we are distributed in terms of IT deployment, right? Quite clearly, when we talk about today's enterprise hybrid IT setup, it's built on the true foundation of on-prem data centers and multi-cloud, both from a compute standpoint, they're more centralized in nature, right? As like we saw when we talk of data centers, you might have a consolidation. So all the consolidation led to central on-premise centralized data centers, augmented with cloud computing environments. And in today's context, we see a lot of organization going for a multi-cloud setup as well. But again, all these cloud environments, primarily I'm talking about public cloud environments, are again centralized, hosted at one particular location. So if you see a percentage breakout vis-a-vis our understanding of the market, almost 62% of your IT resources are still, and I'm talking about across large to mid-scale organizations in India, 62% of IT resources are still deployed in an on-premise environment. It's a fairly big number, right? 29% is on public clouds, and a very bare minimum 9% is deployed on edge sites. Now, it's important that I call out one data here. When I say 9% is deployed on an edge site, you may wonder that while being a small number still sounds big, but how many of us actually have edge sites or in location? So edge as a concept has also grown over time. When we, by edge sites here, what we're trying to essentially establish is, a remote location, a small data center set up in, say, in one of your remote setups or tier 3, tier 4 towns where you have some work going on. That's a classical definition of how we look at edge sites. But as we all are aware, with how times have changed, edge sites are going to mushroom across. We'll see a lot of POPs being supported and being used as edge locations. And in our corresponding slides, we'll also see the benefits and usage of edge sites. So, but clearly, as you can see, more than 2/3, which is almost 65 to 70% of organizations polled, seem to suggest that they have implemented a multi-cloud or a hybrid IT strategy, or they plan to do that probably by the end of this year, right? And I think the reasons, because obviously as an analyst firm, we need to understand A, what you've done, and B, why you've done it. So some of the key priorities and motivators of having such a multi-cloud and hybrid IT environment is as follows. No guesses here in terms of what's new. I think it's fairly straightforward, but still just to refresh your memory, as I said, 74%, for instance, they want to have a hybrid IT, a multi-cloud environment for improved agility and scalability, at the same time not compromise on control and security. So you essentially, and that is actually so true to the definition of hybrid IT, isn't it? I mean, you are actually trying to get the best of both, right? Then again, typical examples of how hybrid IT operates, you're separating the more critical workloads to the less sensitive workloads in an integrated environment. So what you're essentially trying to do is, probably, not saying that this is the rule, but my assumption is you probably want to keep your more mission critical applications closer to your, closer to home, and you want to keep it in your on-premise data centers while offloading some of your non-mission applications onto the cloud, right? And this is much truer for established organizations, especially the biggish mid-size organizations, right? That holds true for them, right? Then again, very important, we've seen how containers, how microservices have come in, how composable infrastructure has come in. So I think it enables, modern architecture with microservices, So all in all, I think this is how we've traveled the journey, and this is how some of the top motivators trump when we talk about multi-cloud environment. But when we talk about the future of hybrid IT, and this is something that I'll probably request you to take a note of. If you remember the data points that I just shared with you, a previous slide, roughly around 60 to 62% was on premise, right? Around 29% was on cloud, and a bare minimum 9% was on edge sites. But going forward, as per our data, we see even more distributed IT resourcing. So if you see the distribution of IT resourcing on-premise and cloud, is almost at par, right? So 40% on-premise, 39% on public cloud. But more interestingly, the offset of that also happens on edge sites. So and let me also remind you, when I say edge sites could be provisioned through a cloud service provider, and but in more often than not, it can be provisioned in-house, because basically how we define an edge location is closer to the where the action is happening, right? So in fact, there were certain reasons for edge sites to mushroom. We see with the advent of, say, 5G, IoT, edge site locations, I think all of this kind of create a convergence, and hence we see, for instance, more than 50% of the data which is created by IoT will be stored, analyzed and processed right at the edge, and this is near term. So 2025 is almost around the corner, right? And a number of applications at edge, we see a exponential growth, 8x growth in terms of applications residing at the edge itself. So this is one area which seems to have a lot of reckoning, right, as we move ahead. So, but the question then comes quite clearly is, why is edge becoming such an integral part of our hybridity? I think it's primarily because of what we can achieve by having an edge infrastructure, a composable, constant congruent element of a hybrid IT process. So, for instance, to name just a few, for instance, to improve and optimize performance, because the data is locally stored. So you work on the principle low latency, So and not so much so, and also because you're storing the data locally, you're processing the data locally, so you can only focus on the necessary data. Yeah. Second, like I said in the past, with the advent of AI, IoT, and blockchain, edge sites in conjunction with cloud and on-premise data centers, it helps you integrate emerging technologies. Then third, considering the fact that you have many smart devices, it could be industrial IoT setups, it could be standard IoT devices, location-based devices, and so on and so forth. So the volume and velocity of data is increasing day by day, and so we literally live in an always-on digital landscape. And for this, it is important that data gets stored locally, analyzed locally, and distributed locally, right? And then finally, very importantly, what you provide, considering that you would want to be in an always-on mode, you're providing a consistent digital performance across the mesh, be it in a public cloud environment, in a private cloud setup, on-premise setup, which could be in a colo, or in an edge site. So I think, so all in all, if you see, this is a conducive environment that you're trying to create, right? Coming to the use cases of edge computing, like I said, far and few, but then the ones that we see being adopted in initial years, starting from the left and going to the right, we see a lot of application of edge for CDN industry. I think content delivery, CDN has always in the forefront of using the latest technologies, and I think conceptually the fact of when we talk about content delivery media, it's always closer to the site. Typical great example is of how OTTs, for instance, use CDN to be closer to the area of catchment. So I think edge computing will help achieve a lot in this particular industry. Then quite importantly, industrial IoT, like I said, industrial IoT makes for a great example of how edge computing reduces your latency and the need to scale up in and out as per requirement. Then this is an emerging area, how flexible and distributed digital workspaces can be enabled by having more smaller data center setups. Gone are the days where you probably have a say 150, 250 seater. We may consider having smaller setups near to the catchment area of employees. So that's an upcoming trend. Fourth, areas of supply chain management, and last, this is I won't say so near term, but lot is being said and spoken is around connected and autonomous vehicles. If not, because autonomous vehicles probably is a thing of the future, but we see a lot being done and delivered around connected vehicles. That's something that is being established as we speak. So I think edge computing and IoT enabled vehicles is something that is as near term as one can possibly think of. So like I said, some of the use cases for IoT, but in all of this, let's also admit that managing such a hybrid environment, you have multiple moving parts in this, right? You have your traditional data centers which is spread across geographies. You have a multi-cloud environment, not just one. I mean, you're not dealing with just say one single cloud service provider. You probably have certain applications hosted on one CSP and the other on a different CSP, right? So there were times when managing multi-cloud in itself was a challenge, right? So you needed a console or what we used to call, back in our days, a cloud management platform to see what is happening across our cloud environments. So managing multi-cloud itself is a challenge in itself, right? And to add to that complexity, you have the distributed edge, right? So you have three things to deal with: your on-premise data centers, your multi-cloud environment, and a distributed edge near to your location. So some of the challenges that probably I would want you to look into: as I said, the complexity of orchestration and integration of varied clouds and endpoints, right? So that's a challenge. B, considering that there's so many moving parts, how do I optimize cost? Because at the end of the day, we are all answerable to our stakeholders, be it our senior management, our board, or to our customers, right? Where do I spend? How do I spend? Is it giving me the best on the buck, right? The third point, like I said, a challenge in itself is managing multiple vendors for your cloud and edge locations, right? Then the fourth, a very important point is, when I talk about hybridity, we know the benefits I said, and I think it was covered fairly well in my second or third slide. But important to understand that when I talk about a true hybridity environment, I'm talking about an environment where you're using a public cloud environment with an on-premise setup, classically, right? But imagine how lopsided it would be, but you are working in a monolithic environment in your on-premise data center, whereas in a public cloud environment, you're working with microservices, containers-based environment with the latest infrastructure to support, right? So I think that leads to inflexibility as far as traditional data centers go. So is there a way to resolve that? I think that's covered in my subsequent slide. Then there are issues about regulatory compliance, challenge with data and app security, and difficulty of managing applications across the landscape, right? So is the answer somewhere in data center modernization? So I think data center modernization is more of a theme than a solution. So when we talk about data center modernization, as the term suggests, there are several ways of achieving that, right? And we'll probably cover one aspect today. But more importantly, the reason why we need to have data center modernization to make your hybridity effective is as follows. You need to make sure that you're compatible with a multi-cloud environment, right? You need to provide a consistent performance. Third, very importantly, like I said, if you want to make both the sides of this seesaw stable, you need a simplified and unified management experience, right? And last but not least, very, very important, not to negate that cost is something that we all need to consider. But when you build infrastructure, right, you build infrastructure for the future. Because we all know, when we talk about be it endpoints or your data center products and solutions, it's important that you future-proof your investments for a certain period of time at least, right? Because we know the reality that we live in, money spent across technologies in a country, and a cost-conscious country like ours, these are long-term investments. So I want to reduce, I want to make sure that I am future proof as far as my IT investments go, right? So how do I make sure that there's an ability to integrate with emerging technology and APIs? So one of the ways of to do that, A is this. So A, when we look at a modern IT and data center setup, mostly they will be software defined, right? They will be using composable and converged data center environments. B, there will be purpose built sites as far as edge sites go, using the latest of edge sites with consistent performance. And last but not least, when we talk about any IT infrastructure, all your IT infrastructure is there to support your applications. So A, in today's modern IT setup, all your applications are refactored and they're provisioned through microservices. And they're optimized for performance across edge, on-premise and cloud. This now in comparison, if you look at for traditional data center, there were issues about legacy edge size. Most of your data centers were either non-virtualized or semi-virtualized. And then, like I said, they had legacy monolithic applications, which had inconsistency in terms of application performance. So the need of the hour for a modernized data center, as per data that is shared with our friends from the CR community, focus on virtualizing your data center environments, making sure that your data centers are software defined, as we call it, software defined data centers. A lot is being happening in terms of data center consolidation, around DC orchestration and automation, and to make this entire experience uniform, across a hybrid IT environment, make sure that you have a unified management console to it all also. One of the ways of data center modernization and to make it software defined is around hyper-converged infrastructure. And before I come to the benefits of hyper-converged infrastructure and what it essentially entails, certain data points which will help you understand where the proclivity lies. So if you see fair bit of numbers suggesting that they're already in the path of discovery of what the benefits of hyper-converge are. And a big number, 75% of enterprises are seeming to suggest, that they have the intentions to adopt and deploy HCI. So I think if you step back, for instance, when we talk about, say, server virtualization, which has been a stellar success all across, with India also being a country where we've seen very successful deployments of server virtualization across organizations. And the reasons for that was fairly straightforward, because A, you were trying to minimize your data center footprint, reducing costs, manageability was easier, and so you were trying to essentially increase your utilization of your IT infrastructure. So the entire concept of a hybrid or a hyper-converged infrastructure is to take this story forward. And this is a story wherein you have your network, storage and compute all under, say, one box. So what you're doing is you're converging the three core elements of a data center, which is namely, like I said, your compute, your storage and network, all done through one box. So I think this has been a transition also, right from a desperate data center setup to a consolidation of data centers, to a convergence of IT equipments, to making it composable, refactoring your applications, to a more modernized way of how I use hyper-converged infrastructure to achieve what we started out from a data center modernization setup perspective. Some of the key advantages, as you can see, easier to virtualize and automate a data center infrastructure setup. In the long run, it reduces TCO and increases efficiency, right? Simplified management across on-premise and edge infrastructure, primarily because most of your public cloud environments are built around composable or hyper-converged infrastructure themselves, right? Seamless integration with edge nodes, high scalability to ensure that you are future-proofed, and consistent operations across, like I said, cloud, on-premise and edge infrastructure. So I think this is where I'll probably like to leave today, and I'll continue this conversation with my learned panel in the next few minutes. But before I do that, some areas that I'll probably request you to look into, ponder is there are certain, while we understand there are certain benefits for DC modernization, but there are certain potential pitfalls to that as well. You know, first, how do I build something new? Do I need to do it all over again? So important to leverage existing investments, and how do I make sure that I integrate what I already have with what is available? Do I need to modernize right from scratch, or do I modernize what I need to do right now? So I think it's very important that you plan for the future as well. A modernization journey is not to cover you for the next foreseeable 1 to 2 years. It is to make it more long term. So rather than making it tactical, I think you should look at your data center modernization initiative more strategic, right? Then comes the question of, should I be just emphasizing on just the core and neglecting the edge, which has been the case so far because the use cases edge were very limited. But as we have seen, a truly modern data center setup needs to integrate the core with the edge, right? Fourth, an area that I think we've heard a lot, there have been issues about cloud repatriation. How do I manage my cloud environment, multi-cloud environments with the on-premise setup? So I think it's important that we eliminate, the risk of rip and replace by leveraging the same management tools across ecosystems of cloud as well as data center setup. And last but not least, should you be relying completely on partners for this modernization initiative? And by modernization, I'm not just confining to a data center, to your complete hybrid IT view. I think it's important for your own sake that you train and upskill your internal IT staff, and you share the responsibility of support with partners in this DC modernization initiative. So I think that's a wrap from my end. Like I said, wanted to quickly cover the main touch points. I'm sure, like I said, my friends from Dell would be sharing more on this. Looking forward to seeing you on the next slide of our panel. Bye for now.